3, 2.
You're listening to Pros and Okay, I need to get out of my head.
Nipe nafasi nikueleze kiasi vile sisi hufanya pande hii ya the tracks. Hatuchezi na kazi, sipoteze wakati, tumekunja mashati.
You're listening to Pros and Possibilities, a collection of candid conversations with the dreamers and doers of our time and from different walks of life. These are the people who are shaping society and culture from wherever they are. We dive deep into their motivation, inspiration, creative process, and most importantly, what they envision for the future of society. I'm your host, Melissa Mbugwa.
Evacuate the area.
I'd like to acknowledge Baraza Media Lab, whose support made this podcast possible. Baraza Media Lab is a community that supports independent media in Kenya. Find out more about them from the link in the episode description. Hello, wonderful people. Welcome to episode 5. For those of you who are joining for the first time, karibuni sana. Remember to hit that subscribe button, leave a rating and review. And remember as well to head on to Twitter and Instagram to follow us. Details are in the episode notes. If you're enjoying this podcast so far, why not send the link to someone you think will appreciate it? Spread that goodness. In this episode, we speak to Nanjala Nyabola, who's a writer, political analyst, and activist. Her work is on African society, politics, technology, international law, and feminism. She's written 2 books that I consider absolutely essential reading for our time. The first is Digital Democracy, Analog Politics, and it's an examination of how the internet era is transforming politics in Kenya. Her second book, Traveling While Black, is a collection of essays reflecting on migration and identity from an African woman abroad. Really interesting perspectives that are hard to come by. Okay, hi Nanjala. Thank you so much for being a guest on Pros and Possibilities, the podcast where we explore what makes change makers tick.
Thank you for having me.
Karibu sana. This is particularly exciting for me because I've known you for a long time, since the high school era. So I think it's very cool that I get a chance to have a sit down with you and ask you questions that I might be able to kind of relate with from back in the day. Yeah, so I'm very excited for this opportunity. You know, in this era of sending emails that start with, I hope this finds you and yours well. I feel compelled. I would have asked you anyway how you're doing. But I feel I need to ask you, how are you holding up in this season and what's keeping you grounded?
That's a fantastic question. It's been a very tumultuous season for myself, just like anybody else. Most of my work in the last 2-3 years, maybe since my book came out, has been, public speaking and obviously all the travel that comes with that. And that has come to a halt. It's also very difficult to see people who work in different industries, whether it's tourism, whether it's restaurants and things like that, struggling. The lady who cleans my house and all of that, it's been difficult to sort of see this experience through their eyes and see people really struggle with this reordering, I guess you would call it. I'm reluctant to call it the new normal because I'm hoping that it doesn't become normalized. Some of the things that we've seen, I'm hoping that it is just, it's a phase that we will find a more just way of ordering our lives after this, because there is a lot of injustice embedded in some of the things that were happening. But it's definitely been an adjustment, and I'm reluctant to sort of expand on that because it most of the problems that I have, or most of the challenges that have come up, are really not insurmountable things in the context of people who have lost everything, who have lost their livelihoods, who've been separated from loved ones permanently, and all of that stuff. People who've died and people who've lost loved ones to this disease. But it's definitely been an adjustment. It's definitely been a difficult season, lots and lots of Zoom. But in the big scheme of things, I'm grateful my family's well, and I am still working, which is a lot more than most.
Yeah, fantastic. And you mentioned something that I just have to pick up on, which is there's some things that you hope we do not continue. So you're not using the word new normal. What are some of the things that you've seen that you think we shouldn't be continuing with?
Well, I think that there's a lot of punitive stuff that's happening that I hate the way we've criminalized the public health response in this country. I hate the way people are being threatened with punishment instead of having the context of the crisis broken down into digestible bits that people can understand. That wearing a mask, don't wear the mask because you're afraid of the police, wear the mask because it's for your own safety and it's for the safety of other people. I hate the way we've given so much power to the state to make all of these determinations about our socioeconomic lives. I think that some of that power needs to go back to our communities, and we need to be deciding at a community level, what do we want our public spaces to look like? How do we want to occupy our public spaces? A lot of this, what some people are calling public health theater, borrowing from the security theater. When people make you write your name and your ID in the book, and they make you, leave your handbag at the entrance of a building or show your ID or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, most of that stuff doesn't really do anything, right? It's really it's a deterrence kind of thing. And I hate that it's become normalized. And I tell people of a certain generation that there was a time that you could walk into a government building without, in my lifetime, this is less than, 30 years ago, you could walk into a government building without having to hand over an ID, and you didn't have to endure leering and scrutiny from security guards and things like that. That people think that it's unimaginable. But I was on a plane, in the 2000s, and I didn't have to take my shoes off, and I didn't have to take my belt off, and I didn't have to, and I carried a full tube of toothpaste, and I got on the plane, and there was no security theater. The way in which we've extended the security theater to public health theater with the thermometers and the sanitizer and all of that, I hope that doesn't become normalized. But also, just like a more basic level, I miss hugs. And I want us to get back to a world where hugging is normal.
I miss hugs too so much. I've started hugging
Yeah.
myself actually. Yeah.
You have to. I mean, I think there's science that backs this up, that handshakes and hugging and all of that stuff, it evolved for a reason, that we need that connection, that it keeps us grounded in our communities. And I'm scared for what the world will look like if we normalize life without them. I even, not even just with your family, but like even with strangers. Handshakes had a very specific evolutionary function, and that's kind of the kind of stuff that I don't want to become normal. I hope that it is something that we're going through in order to survive this crisis, that we can adjust back sooner rather than later.
Speaking of travel and being on planes, you've mentioned I watched one of your TED Talks, and you mentioned about how for you, home is where your suitcase is. So I'm wondering, without that physical anchoring of home, that sense of, or without the
Mm,
image of home being necessarily about the bomber,
mm,
what gives you a sense of home as you travel around the world? Like, for example, do you carry things, or is it memories you have, scents, foods,
hmm.
experiences?
That's a really good question. For me, home is about connection. And I think home
Mm.
is about finding people who are on the same intellectual, spiritual, mental wavelength, and being able to build something with those people. And I felt a sense of home in places that I didn't expect to feel a sense of home, that I expected to just feel like I was constant, like in Geneva, for example. I was an international student in a university in Geneva, and there was a bunch of us international students from different parts of the world. And it's not a place that I would initially have thought, oh, this is a place where I'm going to find my people. But I did. And I still consider them my people. And I still talk to them, 12 years down the line, almost on a semi daily basis. Home for me is a place where you feel wanted and that
Uh-huh.
you have opportunities. And for many people around the world, the physical location where you're from doesn't have that sense of home, because they're constant reminders that you don't belong there. And I think because I've spent so much of my career working with people who have that experience, I'm talking about
Mm-hmm.
refugees and displaced people, I've sort of developed a very abstract notion of what home is. And it makes it easier for me to travel and enter new societies. But it's a very difficult thing to explain to people for whom home must be a place. And in a world where we're constantly being told that all of us must belong somewhere. And if we don't, then we are strange or weird or whatever. I take home with me.
I definitely connect with that. This is something I've been thinking about, and now that you've brought it up, Nanjala, I
Hmm.
get to ask you. Do you think that the future of, for example, international cooperation, like let's say the UN,
Mm.
will evolve from being nation states, so Kenya, Tanzania, USA, to become like collectives or collections of groups of people? So, for example, the vegans of the world are tabling this motion.
Oh,
Or
that would be, that would be the ideal. The strange thing
yeah.
is, for the vast majority of people in the world, that is the reality. The nation state is not their political reality. If you think about, for example, India, you're talking about one sixth of the world's population. China, one sixth of the world's population. Maybe China less so. There are people who never experience the centralized state. There are more people in the world who don't experience the centralized state than there are those who do. And so, what we're trying to do, this whole process of political organization, is we're trying to beat the world into a notion of statehood that the more we try to force it, the more you see it fraying at the edges. And so I think
Mm,
a lot of, honestly, if you go to a village somewhere, in Kenya or somewhere in India or somewhere in, Sri Lanka, whatever, you'll talk to people for whom belonging is not predicated on their national identity. It's predicated on, oh, I go to that church, or I go to that mosque,
yeah.
or go to that temple, or my kid goes to that school. I think for the majority of rich people are now starting to see the disadvantages of being locked into this state centered thing, and they're starting to see that actually there's a different way that we can imagine it. I think that's where we are. I think that for a long time the passport was a marker of privilege, because if you had a passport, you could travel somewhat freely. And then the passport became associated with, some passports are good passports and some passports are bad passports. And then they became hierarchies and things like that. And then rich people started to buy their way out of that structure, right? They start to, for €500,000, you can buy EU citizenship. It's like
Yeah.
there's actually a price tag
Yeah.
on it. Um, and now it's like, well, hang on a second. Was it actually all just a mistake to begin with? And so my hope, if I have a hope in this, it's that people start to realize that the nation state is not inevitable, that is a product of very specific historical forces, that people belong where they feel like they belong, and we have to be open to alternative ways of organizing. And not
Yeah.
every community needs to be contained in a nation state in order to make sense. Some communities, yeah, some communities are just going to be bigger than that. Like, some people really just feel like a strong affiliation or are able to make meaningful relationships and meaningful contributions to the world outside of that. And I think we have to figure a way squaring that circle. I think that's more of the challenge. But I think a lot of people are scared of that because, that's not what the history books tell us. That's not what the textbooks tell us. And it's like, how can I even begin to imagine?
Right. But on the other hand, we haven't had the internet before that has allowed us to so easily connect beyond borders, literally beyond geography. So we haven't ever in human history had a chance to really just
But
demonstrate.
you would be
Yeah.
surprised. Think about
Hmm.
in the 1600s. The oldest body of law in the world is the law of the sea. And the law of the sea was created, it's the oldest sort of codified body of law, let's put it that way. It's the oldest one that had like a treaty and what have you. And the law of the sea comes from this tradition of seafaring nations recognizing that when you're out on the water,
Hmm.
we are all the same. There is no race, there is no
Ah.
whatever. We all have to survive. So, for example, one of the principles of the law of the sea is that a boat can never leave a boat in distress. If you're out in the ocean and you're on a yacht, for example, and there's a guy who is in a dinghy and you let that dinghy sink, you've violated the law of the sea. That's a crime. You have to save people who are out there. So now one of the things that's happening is, if you look at what's happening in the Mediterranean Sea, one of the things that's happening is that European countries are trying to tell rescue ships, you have to let these people drown as a deterrent. You have to do this. And the rescue ships are saying the law of the sea is older than the law
Oh.
of the EU. So I don't care what laws you're passing, we are following the law that brought us out into it. And so seafarers are existing as a community that is beyond nation states, beyond race, beyond all of these things, and are saying we've got to have each other's back. You would there's
So we
things
have a
that
blueprint to
we
to to
have a
learn from.
blueprint. Like the internet, what
Mm,
the internet has done is it's kind
mm,
of expanded the space. It's kind of said,
mm-hmm.
hey, if seafarers can do this, can vegans, can people who crochet be, an international identity? Can people who like Bitcoin be an international identity and things like that? But for people for whom mobility, the oldest people, migrants, same thing if you, the trans-Saharan trade routes, there were rules that anybody who was a traveler had to be treated with welcome. Didn't matter where they came from, didn't matter whatever, you were all entitled to access the oasis. Now the internet is saying, what if this are digital oases? What if we are communities? Like we have blueprints, we have precedents. We just kind of have to look for them in a more expanded way. But they're out there.
Wow. Now you've introduced a new wormhole for me to go into, to dive into. Thank you. Okay, so the internet has simply made it easier for more of us to travel in that
Mm.
sense,
Mm.
in a sense. Do you think though that this is an actual feasible future, like that it's a future we're headed towards, rather than it being pie in the sky
Mm.
dreams?
You know,
Mm,
I think that we have, for myself, my politics has always been that my role is to expand people's political imagination. I think that a lot of the time we are told to be, especially when you become an adult, right? Be practical, do the practical thing, do the thing that makes sense. Blah, 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 blah. And I think that also feeds into the way we do politics and the way we think about our lives. We are, in the
yeah.
biggest sense of the word, we start to make our imagination small and small and small and small and smaller. And so we start to think that everything is inevitable. But when you become a student of history, even in a colloquial sense, like even if you're not going to university, and you start to look into things, you start to realize that a lot of the things that we live, the structures that we live under, are invented. We made them, and that means we can unmake them, and that means we can remake them. So, it's a long way of saying that me personally, I don't think that the way in which our lives is organized is inevitable. I think there's always room for change. It's going to depend on how many people are going to jump on board with the idea that things can change.
Was this something that a way you've always thought since you were a child, or was there
No.
like a moment when you then, okay, so tell me about the how you ended up being this expansive thinker?
No. Oh my gosh, you know this. I was the most orthodox person. Like the most, this is how things are done and this is how they've always been done and that's how things will always be done. I think the thing that changed my life the most was starting to travel and starting to travel
Mm-hmm.
alone, especially because when I started to travel alone and on a budget, I had to learn things about myself and my own capacity for adaptation. And I started to question the things that I thought were inevitable. Suddenly it was like, is that actually inevitable? Like, for example, I'll give you a very, very basic example.
Mm-hmm.
So I have always been a bit of a hygiene freak. Like when I walk into the house, the first thing even before Corona, first thing I do when I walk into my house, I wash my hand. I wash my hands. And like I always said to myself that I would only pee in a toilet. Like that's it. There's no
Yeah.
middle ground. There's not if there's no toilet, there's no peeing. Full stop.
There's
And then that's it. And I'm telling you, when we used to go to Shags, this was long before there was an airport in Kisumu. We used to go to Shags and it used to take like 12 hours. And I would hold it. I would hold it
what?
for 12 hours. So I'd be like, I am not peeing in the bush.
Yeah.
Because that was my mindset. And I started backpacking. And I didn't have, and you're staying in these $8, $2, $3 campsites for weeks on end. And it's like, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? So I tell you some of the places that I've peed. I peed in the Sahara Desert, in the Sahel, in weird places in Tanzania, weird places in Zambia, weird because I once did a backpacking trip from Cape Town to Nairobi over 3 weeks. Just stop, 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 stop. And at one point, you start to ask yourself, have all of these things that I've always said were mandatory to the way that I organize my life been an illusion that I've given myself to make myself think that, so that I don't have to think too deeply about my space in the world? It was really travel that got me to start to question first. And if you start to question where you will pee, you start to question other things. You start to question
It's ground zero.
politics.
You
It's ground
question the thing.
zero.
What are you not gonna? What are you not gonna question?
You're right. So everything's on the table now. If I can pee behind a tire in the Sahara Desert, then where can politics take me? And I think travel it opened up the world, it opened up myself, and I started to expand that into the way that I thought about things. It developed my curiosity for alternatives, it developed my curiosity for change, it developed my curiosity for stretching myself intellectually and physically. And that's really where all of this comes from. When I started to really throw myself into that, life is a journey, be open to experiences, be open to communities, be open to people, suddenly everything was just up in the air. And the way things have been falling back into place has been leaning towards more critical and a more, what's the word I'm looking for? Just everything is up for analysis kind of orientation.
Amazing. Yeah, I definitely relate to travel as the experience that just begins to unravel it all, which is scary, but then it's how you expand, right? Like if you don't question. But that's the thing. And I think that's a very reason why many societies, many cultures tend to dissuade and scare people away from questioning, because then they can't handle the chaos, and the status quo will inevitably then be challenged if people start questioning. Very interesting.
Yeah. I think it makes power anxious, because then you lose the power. Yeah, because you can't tell people because I said so. You have to tell them why. You think about how a lot of us are raised, and you don't break my glasses. You say, why? Because I said so. But what would happen if you actually broke the glass? No one would die. Like, it would be, it wouldn't be ideal. You'd have one less glass, but it'd be like, okay, that's fine. I think that's kind of why power hates that. It hates when people it hates critical thinking, hates critical thinkers, hates giving people the tools they need to think for themselves, because suddenly they have to think about why they're prohibiting things, why they're banning things. If Kenyans start to question these broken thermometers at the entrances of all these shopping malls, what power would the government have to pretend that they're under control? None.
Right.
So that's where it is. You're absolutely right.
Knowing that you're this person who, in your work and in your travels, is the provocateur, so to speak. How do you? Well, yes, just by being yourself. It's not like you're trying to upset things,
I'll
but
accept
by
it.
speaking up, and by having this mindset, you're already. We are, and let me not even. I'm not accusing you. Actually, I'm part of that squad as well.
All right.
My question is, I'm wondering how you find, and do you even remember like a before and after, like how you'd relate with authority versus now, or how authority or power reacts to your presence in a room, metaphorically and literally?
I think I do. I remember the before and after, because I remember the trip that changed everything. And I remember it very clearly when I went to Burkina Faso alone. And the after, first of all, began with a process of unlearning deference and unlearning. I think in Kenya we're socialized to just lick the boots of power. And when a politician walks in the room, you say "Mheshimiwa," and you bow, and there's this performance of obedience that is indoctrinated in us. From reciting the loyalty pledge every Friday, and sort of all of these indoctrinations. And I think we grow up being very deferential to power. And I stopped caring about what power thought about me when power became demystified. And, Michelle Obama said something that I think is, people underestimate the power of what she said. She said that she's been in a lot of these rooms with these powerful people and they're just not that smart. And someone saying something like that, you think, oh, she's just being arrogant. but it's really true. It's really, we give power, in its in various guises, well, political power, institutional power. We give it so much deference and mystique. Like in The Wizard of Oz, where the wicked witch is like behind the screen and they think that it's this really powerful person, but it's actually just this tiny lady, tiny guy. Like that's exactly what power is. And so when the mysteries of power became apparent and it sort of knocked power off the pedestal, suddenly it didn't matter what they thought about me. It was more important what the people who didn't have power thought of me. It was more important that people who didn't have power felt safe around me and felt seen and felt respected. Suddenly it stopped being about making powerful people happy and started to be about being useful to people who didn't have power. And that in many ways informs my politics and is intertwined in all the work that I do. It's more important for me, for example, to write an article that makes a victim of extrajudicial execution feel seen and heard and advocated for than to write an article that makes a Kenyan politician feel, I don't know, whatever they feel.
Yeah.
It flips the switch because you start to, even your work starts to look different. Suddenly your audience is not, let me be accepted, let my book become a bestseller, let my whatever, win a Pulitzer, but it becomes, have the people that I've written about, do they feel seen? Do they feel heard? Do they feel advocated for? Yeah.
Profound. And speaking of books, let me take you back to high school. What was your favorite set book in high school and how did it shape your worldview?
Oh God, I hated those safe books. I hated them so much. I'll tell you,
Why?
they were,
Yeah.
you know what it is? You know what I hate most? Reading literature in high school is like doing a dissection.
Yes.
Once we started dissecting rabbits, I could no longer eat rabbits. And it wasn't because I was some vegan thing. It was like, it's like, there's nothing left. You've ruined it. I'll tell you, the one set book that I liked was the one that upset the teachers the most, which, not the most, it was the second most. The one that upset the teachers the most was Q, because it had a sex scene. And I remember the Kiswahili teacher lost her. Q was a Tanzanian writer, I think Said bin Said or something like that. And there was a paragraph that was a sex scene. And I remember they lost their minds. The day we had to read that text in class, I mean, I swear the Swahili teacher's head was going to explode. It was very hilarious. But the second one, the one that was second on the list of making teachers uncomfortable was Looking for a Rain God. Because Looking for a Rain God was a short story collection and it had a short story by my favorite writer, Bessie Head. And the thing about the story, I'm not going to spoil it, but the thing about the story is that it doesn't go the way people want it to go. Like, you want it to be a very neat story about a drought and then this happens and everybody lives happily ever after. And it doesn't go that way. And I could see the English teacher struggling with it because should you teach 16-year-old kids something that violent and something that unapologetically violent? And so she refused to teach it.
Okay.
She refused to teach it. We taught all the other stories in the collection except the one that gave the book its title. And so,
Yeah, what effect did that have on the class?
I loved it. The thing is, you remember us. My class was very subversive, and we enjoyed making. I feel ashamed, but it's been 20 years. It's fine. They forgive us. We enjoyed making the teachers uncomfortable, even though at heart we were all big nerds, and we were all gonna study anyway. We just kind of enjoyed pushing them and pushing them and pushing them, and so we really had a good laugh about the set books. Because it was very clear but you know what it was? I think it was very clear that there was a generational shift that was happening. And I think the teachers were struggling with this new generation of young women who were so clear on who they were very early on and were so clear that they needed more from this very strict environment than what they were getting. I think at heart, that's what the push and pull was that from that year, sort of the next couple of years, you were suddenly dealing with a different kind of teenager, not the kind of person who could be told, don't do that, and then would just accept it, but the person who would say, why must I not do that? And I think that's what the teachers were struggling with. So for me, looking for a rain god was like one of those examples where it was like, why aren't you teaching us this book? Like, why aren't you teaching us this story? Like there's no sex, there is no, nothing offensive, there's no language. Why aren't you teaching us this story? And it became a thing.
Do you think did that experience like inform, maybe even unconsciously, inform your understanding
of power? No,
power,
I tell you what.
relations, of freedom?
I tell you what did. We used to do this thing where you would, like history and geography, you would memorize the textbook and then you would just like regurgitate because there was never any nuance. And I finished regurgitating the Form 3 history syllabus very early, like literally with one semester to go. And so the history teacher at the time gave me a copy of Das Kapital. Karl Marx. I don't even think that people know this. But she gave me a copy of Das Kapital when I was 16 years old and told me to read it because I looked like I was getting bored. And I devoured it in one weekend. And it was the first time that I had a teacher who, because I had been reading above my grade level for my entire life, but it was always having to leave that part of yourself at home when you go to school, because at school you have to read what everybody else is reading. And so there was always this duality in my life whereby in school I was feeling a little bit understimulated, and then I would go home and my mom never really questioned books. She would just give me whatever books I wanted to read. And so I was reading very heavy stuff very early on. And it was the first time that a teacher had done that for me.
Yeah.
And it changed my relationship with authority because suddenly it was no longer confrontational. It was relational, but also showed that there could be a different way of doing things. That it didn't have to be a lecture. It didn't have to be Somayana. It didn't have to be, don't do it because I said so. It could be, hey, here's an alternative way of using your energy. I think that remains one of the most and then suddenly it became a pattern, because then, my biology teacher, I was like, oh, you've done this, here, have this book. It's a little bit harder than what is on the syllabus, but maybe it'll stretch you. I had, honestly, even if you look at my report cards, you will see that when I hit Form 3, there was just this dramatic change, because suddenly the school was working with me and not against me. And I think that was it. I don't consider myself subversive. I consider myself to be critical. And I always think that the way in which systems are structured works better when you're working with people rather than against them. And I think that's what I want us to get at with like our society in Kenya. Stop with this because I said so thing and start with, let's figure this out together. Let's help each other out.
And if the people who are questioning, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're trying to destroy. They're just asking for more or something else.
They're just asking for something else. They're asking for a relational thing with power rather than a confrontational thing. And that's not to say that there is no space for subversion. I think subversion is really important. I think dissent is really important. I think pushing the boundaries of what is possible is really important. More, it's to say that we have to move away from this head boy, head girl paradigm, right? So I think for Kenya, what I want us to move away from is this prefect, head boy, head girl model of governance to a collaborative. I think that's where, I don't know, I feel like that's where some of the answers to the problems that we are facing. Look at the public health situation with coronavirus. Like, what if instead of threatening and arresting and beating and whatever, we actually said to people, hey guys, huge public health crisis. We don't have the resources to deal with it at the moment. Let's work together.
Yeah. What do you think? What are your ideas? What do you have
in your
community?
We're not going to build world-class hospitals in 3 months. Okay, so then we need to move to prevention. okay, how can people be part of the prevention? How can we think, like everything just can't be because I told you so, because I have power, because I know best.
And finally, what have you read lately that people who are into leadership and that people in leadership should be paying attention to?
Oh, that's a good question. That is a great question. I'll tell you this. I don't read a lot of a couple of years ago, I did an experiment where I challenged myself to not read a book written by a white man for a year. And I ended up doing it for a year and a half. So I read a lot of books that people might not necessarily pick up when they go into a bookstore. It completely changed the way that I read. I'm reading a lot of things that people would, even I myself would not have picked up. What have I read lately that would make people think differently about leadership?
Just anything you think people who are curious should be
about the
looking
world.
at.
My favorite book is it my favorite book? It's definitely in the top 3. Representations of the Intellectual by Edward Said. It actually exists. It was a lecture. So the BBC has this REAP lectures that they invite someone to give every year, and then they record them. And then when they do really well, they turn them into books. And it was the 1993 REAP lectures. It's available as a podcast, as a video on YouTube, but I read it as a book and I read it every year. And the reason why I read it every year is because it is a reminder of what the role of the public intellectual is in public life. It's a challenge. It's an invitation for people to take up the mantle of public intellectualism as a responsibility and obligation to the present moment and to history. But also he doesn't think that an intellectual is a person who lives in the university and wears tweed coats with leather patches on the elbows, but he uses Antonio Gramsci had this formulation of the organic intellectual, that anybody can be an intellectual wherever they are, wherever they're situated, that being an intellectual is not defined by your institution, but is defined by your orientation towards the world, the curiosity about the world and your desire to make the world a better place, especially for people who have no power. And so representations of the intellectual kind of builds on that idea, but in a very accessible and very direct way, is saying, this is what you could do for the world, and this is what you should be thinking about doing for the world. And I love it. I think it's a really good way for people to remember the place of ideas in social change, that, there's space, there's a need for ideas that have been well thought out and well articulated. And there's a need for us to use those ideas to stand between power and the powerless, and to defend the rights of the powerless, and to protect the powerless from the excesses of power, which is what he thinks the role of the public intellectual is. So if there is anything that I would recommend to anybody, it would be Representations of the Intellectual. It's very short. It's like 100 pages.
Nice. I am going to get on it, be sure.
Please.
Thank you so much, Nanjala. This has been amazing.
Thank you. It's been amazing.
If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to spread the love, and let's keep talking. Check out the episode notes to find our contact deets and more juice from this discussion. Thank you for listening.